All right, well, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here this morning. We are continuing our study of the book of Samuel. And this is the last class of this quarter and the last class of the first part of the book of Samuel. As we've mentioned about every Sunday, this is one book. 1st and 2nd Samuel is originally one story, so kind of made it easier. I was telling Brother Barry, there's no need for a review this morning or anything like that. End of a quarter, end of a book, you'd usually do something like that, but we're only halfway through. So we are just continuing on in our study of this rich text that we've been going through for this quarter. Last week was our gospel meeting. The week before, Michael had covered chapters 26 to 28. So I want to do just a quick, brief review to kind of get our minds back on track in the book of Samuel, because it's been a few weeks. Before we do that, let's go to God in prayer. Our most holy, loving Father in heaven, hallowed be your great name. We're so thankful for this opportunity that we have to assemble together as Christians, as sheep of your pasture, to study your word. And we pray that you would impart your wisdom into us this morning. We pray for discernment, and we pray for a deeper knowledge of the truth and a deeper knowledge of who you are and who you've called us to be as we study this book of Samuel. We pray this in Jesus' holy name. Amen. So back in chapter 26, to kind of catch us up in our review, chapter 26, of course, we saw David, who has been on the run. David, who has been the hunted, has, in a sense, become the hunter. He sneaks into the camp, finds Saul asleep in the middle of his thousands who are circled around him, of Saul's troops. Saul sleeping with a spear by his head. Deep sleep that the Lord had given to those people, but David did not act on any sort of retribution or revenge on Saul. He couldn't do it. He wouldn't lay his hands on the Lord's anointed. In chapter 27, we see David in his now home base of Ziklag in the land of the Philistines, but yet he is from afar still battling the Lord's enemies. And the tactic of deception which he has employed in previous chapters is still certainly the case here, with maybe confusing Achish on exactly his motives and what he was trying to accomplish and whose side David was really on. Was he really on the side of the Israelites, or was he on the side of the Philistines? And then chapter 28, of course, one of the most famous chapters, maybe, or stories in this book, was Saul, who had inquired of the Lord, but the Lord had stopped responding to Saul. And the Lord has already taken his spirit from Saul and given it to David. And so what does Saul do? Instead of inquiring of the Lord, and instead of waiting on him to answer, perhaps the Lord was done talking to him. And so Saul goes so far as to inquire of a pagan witch, a pagan medium, to try and ascertain from her how to proceed. And chapter 28 through the end of this book, chapter 31, is what we're going to try to wrap up today. And I'm not exactly sure the timeline. I don't know that anybody exactly knows the timeline, but these chapters are not in chronological order. And perhaps, from what I could try to wrap my head around, these final chapters are showing David's battle with the Amalekites and Saul's battle with the Philistines kind of side by side in these days. David, as we'll see, inquiring of God with the ephod on how to proceed with the Amalekites. And then you have Saul kind of alongside, maybe even on the same day or at the same time roughly, Saul's inquiring of the witch of Endor. And so these final chapters, we're continuing to see this contrast between the Lord's anointed, truly anointed, and David, the true king of Israel, versus Saul. And just the sad, pitiful condition that Saul has brought himself to, ultimately. That pillar of God's house in Saul coming down was of his own doing. And so that's where we left off at the end of chapter 28. I couldn't help but think of Saul dining, having this feast with the witch of Endor and their associates. It reminded me of Proverbs chapter 9. You know, you've got the Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly. And Lady Folly at the end of Proverbs 9, that first section of Proverbs, those who feast with her, ultimately, there are the dead at that table. It's just this eerie scene of where Lady Folly has brought this victim whom she has ensnared. And here we have Saul in a very similar situation. The curse of disobedience, the feast of Lady Folly, and the dead are in the company. And so that brings us to chapter 29. Chapter 29 begins, "Now the Philistines had gathered all their forces at Aphek." Does anybody remember what happened at Aphek? Very important turn of events that happened there earlier in this book. Does anyone recall? The Ark of the Covenant was captured. Hophni and Phinehas died. Eli ends up dying because of the news of that and because of the news of the Ark of the Covenant being captured at Aphek. And then, of course, you had the grandson of Eli, who is Ichabod. You know, where is the glory? The glory of God has departed. So maybe a pretty significant reference here, all the way back from chapter 4, a foreshadow to here, to remind us of that battle, because it was very significant. Where is the glory of God? The glory has departed from Israel, or so it would seem. And verse 1 continues, "The Israelites were encamped by the spring that is in Jezreel. As the lords of the Philistines were passing on by hundreds and by thousands, David and his men were passing on in the rear with Achish. The commanders of the Philistines said, 'What are these Hebrews doing here?' And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, 'Is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me now for days and years, and since he deserted to me? I have found no fault in him to this day.' But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him. And the commanders of the Philistines said to him, 'Send the man back,' that is David, 'that he may return to the place to which we have assigned him. He shall not go down with us into battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord?'" Speaking of Saul. "Would it not be with the heads of the men here? Is this not David, of whom they sing to one another in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. What may be a couple of instances, examples, that the Philistine lords here would be mindful of as they pursue ahead into battle with David in their company? What are some examples that they may say, I kind of remember him doing this and that. Do you remember anything that he did to the Philistines so far in the story? The Goliath, obviously, and what did he do to Goliath? He took his head off. Okay, and that's one of many decapitations that we see in the first part, and we'll see in the second part of Samuel. But also, if you remember back in chapter 18, when Saul said, "Okay, you want to marry Michal? I'll accept no bride price except for 100 foreskins of the Philistines," and he did, and he followed through with that. And so the Philistines have a lot of reasons to be suspect of David, and it's hard to blame them here. In verse 6, Achish called David and said to him, "As the Lord lives, Lord Jehovah lives, you have been honest, and to me it seems right that you should march out and end with me in the campaign, for I've found nothing wrong in you from the day of your coming to this day. Nevertheless, the lords do not approve of you. So go back now and go peaceably, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines." And David said to Achish, "But what have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" And Achish answered David and said, "I know that you are as blameless in my sight as an angel of God." It's maybe a funny reference from a pagan king. Maybe Achish knew something of God, the true God, and something of the kingdom by being with David all this time.
But he was doing anything but being honest to him.
That's right. That's right.
He was lying to him the whole time.
That's right. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, "He shall not go with us to the battle. Now then, rise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who came with you, and start early in the morning and depart as soon as you have light." So David set out with his men in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, but the Philistines went up to Jezreel. What do you think about this David not being allowed to proceed into this battle? Is this a good thing or a bad thing?
He covered him.
What's that?
It had to be the Lord acting on his behalf.
Yep.
Otherwise, he would fight his own people, which he did not want to do.
Yeah. So there are a lot of reasons why this was a deliverance. Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's kind of like another Abigail intervention for David, where he's going to be faced with this potential thing that he ought not do, and it almost seems like God steps in and makes the decision for him, so that he keeps his hands guiltless for when he becomes king.
Absolutely. That's a great point. This is a pretty tight situation that David is in here. And even though maybe David wanted to go into battle, the odds were stacked against him from both sides of how that was going to go down. Either the Philistines were probably going to kill him, or Saul and his men were going to kill him, or he was going to kill Saul, and there was no winning in that situation. But David's deliverance here is very significant, and it plays into the rest of the story, which continues on in the next chapter. Chapter 30. Now when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, okay, so they go back home to Ziklag, the Amalekites have made a raid against the Negeb and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire, taken captive the women and all who are in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. So here we have the Amalekites, again, the thorn in the side of God's people. When was the last time, do you remember the last time we saw the Amalekites in this story? And who was battling the Amalekites? The last that we saw earlier in 1 Samuel.
Saul and David.
Saul. Yeah, Saul. And remember, Saul was supposed to devote the Amalekites to complete destruction, but he didn't. He did the opposite. He destroyed that was worthless and was useless, and he kept the best, and then he spared the life of Agag, the king. And that was really one of the defining moments of the fall of Saul. He was supposed to devote to destruction. He didn't. He did what he wanted to do. He did what he felt was right, rather than adhering to what the Lord had commanded. And remember, Samuel strongly rebuked Saul for doing this. And then Samuel finished the job himself and hacks King Agag to pieces. But the Amalekites were an ancient enemy of God. If you remember back Exodus 17, when when the Israelites were in the wilderness, when they had left Egypt, the Amalekites had attacked, and they attacked those who were in the far rear. So the Amalekites have a history of battling and taking advantage of the weak and those who were vulnerable and easily taken advantage of. This is a characteristic of the Amalekites. Deuteronomy 25 mentions as much. And so here we are, the Amalekites again. In verse 3, David and his men came to the city of Ziklag, and they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's 2 wives also had been taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him. The people are so distraught, this is so terrible, that they don't know what to do. And so they're thinking about killing David, because this is just so awful. All the people were bitter in soul, for each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. David, not seeking to act on his own emotions, but rather turning to God, strengthening himself in God. And David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, "Bring me the ephod." Okay, this prescribed means of communicating with God. And Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David inquired of the Lord, contrasted to Saul inquiring through the medium of Endor. And David says, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I pursue after this band, the Amalekites? Shall I overtake them?" And the Lord answered David, "Pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue." So David set out with 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook Besor, where those who were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and 400 men. 200 stayed behind, who were too exhausted to cross the brook of Besor. And they found an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David. And they gave him bread and he ate. They gave him water to drink, and they gave him a piece of cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. And David said to him, "To whom do you belong, and where are you from?" And the man said, "I'm a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite. My master left me behind because I fell sick 3 days ago. We had made a raid against the Negeb of the Kerethites, and against that which belongs to Judah, and against the Negeb of Caleb. We burned Ziklag with fire." And David said to him, "Will you take me down to this band?" And he said, "Swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master. I will take you down to this band." And so David and his men come across this man who has been left behind by the Amalekites. Maybe another contrast between the Amalekites and how they treated their own soldiers. Well, if you get sick, well, tough luck. You're going to just die out here. We're going to continue on. As opposed to the kind of leader that David proves to be to his troops and his men, which we'll see a little later on in this chapter. And this man has agreed to point David and the Israelites to this band of the Amalekites. In verse 16, when he had taken him down, behold, they were spread abroad all over the land. That's the Amalekites, eating and drinking and dancing because of all the great spoil that they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. You remember when these battles and these victories weren't just celebrating the spoils. They weren't just celebrating the fact that they defeated these people militarily. How else were these enemies of God celebrating when a victory like this took place? What else did this mean? There's a deeper meaning to this.
Well, they were celebrating their God.
That's right. That's right. They were celebrating the fact that their God was stronger than the God of Israel, the God of whomever they were taking over. And we'll see a lot more of that through the end of this book as well. So here we have the Amalekites out in the open country having a festival of sorts. And David struck them down from twilight until the evening of the next day. Not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who mounted camels and fled. So David soundly defeating the Amalekites. And remember that timeline, while at the same time, as we'll see, Saul being defeated by the Philistines, which we'll read in the next chapter. But we have the escaping 400 young men of the Amalekites. You remember back in Exodus 17, the Lord had promised, he told Moses to tell Joshua that the Amalekites were going to be completely erased from the face of the earth. And Moses telling Joshua that, these guys are going to be a problem forever. We're going to have war with them from generation to generation. But the Lord had promised that ultimately they would be completely destroyed. But yet, even though David destroys as many as he can, not a man escaped except 400. There's still a remnant of these enemies of God who escaped. And they mounted camels and fled. Before a couple years ago, I watched a video with our boys of camels. These guys out in the desert, somewhere in Syria or somewhere, and they were racing camels. I had no idea. They're like a quarter horse. So this is not a slow escape. These guys got out of there and quickly. And yet, this remnant would eventually be destroyed. I believe it's 1 Chronicles 4. Hezekiah, it said, battled and defeated the remnant of the Amalekites. Maybe those who escaped here may be reference to something else. But at any rate, the Amalekites are still going to be a problem for some time to come. And that was a significant storyline to understand with the book of Esther, which we studied in a recent quarter here. David, in verse 18, David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken. David rescued his 2 wives, and nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that had been taken. David brought back all, and David also captured all the flocks and herds, and the people drove the livestock before them, and said, "This is David's spoil." And David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him, who had been left at the brook Besor, and they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And when David came near to the people, he greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless fellows among the men who had gone with David. So, not everyone who is battling with David is a perfect saint. There are absolutely people battling with David who are imperfect, and yet even way worse than that, they were wicked and worthless fellows, a phrase we've seen a lot in this book, wicked and worthless. I believe the first time we saw that was with Hophni and Phinehas. They were wicked and worthless, the sons of the high priest. But these wicked and worthless fellows among the men with David said, because they didn't go with us, that is, these people who are too exhausted to go with us, we are not going to give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except that each man may lead away his wife and children and depart. What kind of attitude are they expressing here, these wicked, worthless fellows?
Seems like a selfish attitude. They didn't want to share with what they had taken back.
That's right. Unwilling to share, Brother Wayne?
Reminded of the story of workers where some of them worked all day, some of them worked half a day, some of them just worked about an hour, but they all got paid the same. And they were told, it's mine to do, but God can reward who He will reward.
That's right.
Not based on how long they've been His servant.
That's right.
If they're faithful, and the people that were too tired were not faithless. They were not necessarily cowards. It's just if you're having to drag somebody into battle because he's exhausted, that's not going to help you very much.
That's right. Just because those who stayed behind were the weak, that they were still cared for and they were still part of this. Miss Christie?
They're also giving themselves the credit. They're also
That's right.
we that did this, we're the ones that went, we're the ones that defeated them, we're the ones that should take all the spoil and didn't give God any of the credit. And David says later, no, he's the one who protected us.
That's a great point. And, maybe these are some of the same guys that was trying to convince David to kill Saul in previous chapters, and David had to rebuke them, as we've seen in previous weeks.
There were 400 that escaped, and there was only 400 that went to attack.
Yeah, that's right.
So even though they outnumbered them, they were still feared and afraid.
Yeah,
And they weren't that strong anyway. They would attack cities that didn't even have protection. So
that's right. Verse 23, but David said, again, David rebuking those amongst him, you shall not do so, my brothers. Called them brothers, even though they're wicked and worthless. Calls them brothers. You're not going to do this with what the Lord has given us. And again, like Miss Christie, this is not something we accomplish. These spoils of war are not anything we attained of our own doing. The Lord gives victory in the battle, and the Lord has given us the spoil. God has preserved us and given into our hand the band that came against us. Who would listen to you in this matter? You're crazy, in other words. Who would listen to you? For as his share is who goes down into the battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. They shall all share alike. And he made it a statute and a rule from Israel that day, for Israel from that day forward to this day. Back in Numbers chapter 31, after Moses had defeated the Midianites, the Lord told Moses to divide the spoil into two parts, amongst those warriors who went out to battle and amongst those of the rest of the congregation who were back at home. And so David, despite dividing the spoil, may be rooted in the law and rooted in the history of what he knew that God would have. Again, David is a man after God's own heart. But nevertheless, David makes this a statute of how spoils of war were to be divided, that there would be equity amongst those who went out into battle and those who stayed behind. Michael?
So it feels very reminiscent of back in chapter 11, Saul's first big military conquest. At the end of it, excuse me, worthless men come to him and say, like, hey, those guys that didn't respect you before, let's put them to death. And Saul's like, this is the Lord's victory today. How could I do that? And it's the same kind of vibe here, so it's almost feels a little bit literary to me that this story is placed here, and that like this is the kind of the beginning of David really ascending to that throne.
Yeah, David starting to exemplify and embody the type of king that he would be. And that continues on in this last little part of chapter 30. When David came to Ziklag, he sent part of the spoil to his friends, the elders of Judah, saying, here is a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord. It was for those in Bethel, and Ramoth of the Negeb, and Jetar, and Aror, and Sipmoth, and Estima, and Rekal, and the cities of the Jeremites and the cities of the Kenites. I'm just butchering these words, y'all. I'm not proclaiming. I don't know Hebrew, and I'm from Mississippi, so I'm doing what I can. In Hormah, and Borashan, and Atak, and Hebron, for all the places where David and his men had roamed. At any rate, like Michael had mentioned, David is coming into his own as the true king of Israel, and he is showing what type of king that he will be, in contrast to what type of king that Samuel had warned when the people were begging for a king. What type of king did Samuel warn against? What was the big attribute that Samuel gave a whole speech about earlier in this book? What was the type of king?
children, go to war,
That's,
take your best of everything.
they'll take. Okay, I know what kind of king you're asking for. It's just like the king of all the other nations of the world. I'll tell you how this is going to go down. They're going to take. And David, in contrast, is a king that conquers, plunders the strong man's house, and divides and shares the spoil, gives gifts, if you will, among men. And who does that remind you of? What future king of Israel would conquer the enemies of the Lord and then divide a spoil amongst all of God's people? I was thinking about Jesus. It's definitely a type of Jesus. Probably not going to get into this for time, but Psalm 68 kind of mentions this theme of God conquering his enemies and dividing spoil, and that kind of ties to Ephesians 4. At any rate, we're going to continue on chapter 31. And by the way, if I don't get to this, Brother Barry, this Wednesday night is going to pick up in 2 Samuel. So for Wednesday night, the first 2 chapters of 2 Samuel is what we ought to read up on beforehand. And as I'd mentioned, this is just a continuation. And yet, these final chapters of the first part of Samuel is in the very center of this whole book of Samuel. And it seems rather significant, and a point that's maybe underscored here, that at the very center of this story, we have the death of a king of Israel, and then God raising up a king of Israel. So sort of a death and resurrection picture, if you will, that this whole book of Samuel hinges on. That's the very middle of this whole book. That's the heart of the matter. Again, all the way back to Hannah's prayer, the Lord setting the pillars of the earth. And then chapter 31, here's a pillar coming down. The Philistines fighting against Israel, okay, probably while David was battling the Amalekites and conquering. But here we have the Philistines fighting against Israel. And the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. So 3 sons of Saul all fell on this same day. Do you ever feel bad for Jonathan? You know, that's really sad. He was such a good man, and yet he falls slain, suffers the same fate of his father. Why did Jonathan... Why did he have to die, maybe?
Because the level of it not challenging David's law.
Yes. Yep. Yeah.
But it's also an Ecclesiastes thing, right? Like, maybe it didn't have to, it's just, that's how it went down.
Well, you had hit what I was thinking on there with Jonathan is the heir apparent to Saul and to his dynasty. And maybe if just Saul died, perhaps the people of Israel would say, well, sorry, David, but we've got Jonathan, and this is the royal line, but it couldn't happen that way. So the Lord creates no excuse here, eliminating not only Saul, but his house. Any of the heir apparents, 3 sons, they're all fallen slain. In verse 3, the battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him. He was badly wounded by the archers, that is Saul. And then Saul said to his armor-bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me. Saul is terrified, and rightly so, of what the Philistines are going to do to him if they catch him alive. It would be something... horrifying, and we will see later that even after his death that he's still in a horrifying situation. Lest these uncircumcised come and mistreat me. But his armor bearer wouldn't do it, for he greatly feared. Who did his armor bearer greatly fear? his armor bearer wouldn't listen because he was afraid, just like David, this is God's anointed. This is the king of Israel. I'm not killing you. What are they going to do to me if I kill you? What's David going to do to me? David's been fighting for you this whole time and has refused to kill you, so I'm not doing that. Therefore, Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. Back when David was battling Goliath, and David took Goliath's own sword and cut his head off, that was a part of the indignity of that situation. That was humiliating to Goliath and to the Philistines that, well, David cut your guy's head off with his own sword. And yet here again, we have another person dying by their own sword, and Saul falling upon his own sword. And when his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him. Thus Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor bearer, and all his men on the same day. Again, hearkening back to the Battle of Aphek. Everybody's dying on the same day. This whole house, this whole pillar of God's house is coming down, but he raises up another. When the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley and those beyond the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their cities. Okay, there's an emphasis here, if you'll see, on the word fell or fall. I didn't count how many times, but it comes up again and again and again. The Philistines, the Israelites fell slain in the first verse. Saul fell on his sword. His armor bearer fell on his sword. The sons of Saul described as having fallen in the valley. And that's going to tie in real well to this next chapter, which is the first chapter of 2 Samuel. Because David, in his song and his lamenting for the death of Saul and Jonathan, he says, how the mighty have fallen. And here this whole chapter is just chock full of the mighty, as it were, having fallen. The king of Israel and all of his men and his sons falling. Verse 7 continues on. Saul and his sons were dead. When the Israelites found this out, they abandoned their cities, that's the Israelites, and they fled. So all the Israelites are fleeing. They're just trying to get out of town. And the Philistines came and lived in them. So the Philistines come and are living in the cities. And what's so wrong with that? What's the bigger picture? The Exodus picture and the conquest of Canaan. What do we see here? The Philistines coming and living in these towns. It's a complete reversal. It's a complete reversal. They were to go into Canaan and clean house. And this is a complete reversal of the conquest of Canaan. And if you remember back in 1 Samuel chapter 9, one of the reasons that the Lord chose Saul was to battle against the Philistines. One of the sole reasons for Saul being at the helm was to conquer and drive out the Philistines and battle against these enemies of God. And yet, here we are, 40 years later. And we're right back to where we started. Nothing has been accomplished. So it's really just a sad state of affairs here. And the next day, the Philistines came to strip the slain, and they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And so they cut off his head and stripped off his armor. Again, his royal clothing and his armor is stripped from him. That's not the first time we've seen that in this book. And sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to the house of their idols and to the people. What is their good news? What's the gospel of the Philistines here? That's right. That's right. Our God, or gods, win this. Our idols are more powerful than Jehovah. And go tell it all around. They put Saul's armor in the temple of Ashtoreth. They fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. And when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and went all night, took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, and they came to Jabesh and burned them there. Why Jabesh Gilead? What's the reference here? What happened at Jabesh Gilead earlier in this book? What was so significant about that? What's that? That's right. That was Saul's first battle. At the helm as the king of Israel, his first battle was at Jabesh Gilead to come to their defense and to battle Nahash, the Ammonite. Nahash, which in Hebrew meant serpent, so he was coming to wage war against the snake, the king of Israel, and he won. And he had a great victory. That was the peak of Saul's career as the king of Israel. And then his final days and his death here, and what is happening to his body even, we still have the Jabesh Gilead to remind us of the rise and the fall, the peak and the valley of Saul's life. And so all the valiant men arose, went all night, took the body of Saul. They're risking their lives doing this to save the body of Saul. And this humiliation that the Philistines are inflicting on Saul's body here, and humiliating the people of Israel and humiliating God. They came to Jabesh and burned Saul's body there. They took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh and fasted 7 days. So we have all these full pictures coming back. The tamarisk tree. When was the last time we saw a tamarisk tree in this book? Do you remember? That's right. And when he was sitting under the tamarisk tree in that chapter, he had a spear in his hand. And he was plotting to destroy David, the anointed of God. He had become an enemy of God, an adversary. And yet those who live by the sword, live by the spear, die by the spear. And he's buried just the same under a tamarisk tree. Thank you all so much for your participation this morning, and look forward to continuing the story with Brother Barry on Wednesday night.